Okay, I think we can make a start. Well, good evening, everyone. You're very welcome at this meeting of the Planning Applications Committee. I'm Councillor James Husband, Chairman of the Committee. To my right, I'm joined by my fellow councillors, and it will be the five of us this evening who will be making the decisions on the matters in front of us this evening. We're also joined by my colleagues who are planning officers sitting on my left, and they are led this evening by Fiona Ray, who is the acting head of development management, sitting on my immediate left. Okay, so I think we can get underway. First of all, are there any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chairman. There are no apologies for absence.
No, very good. Thank you. Declarations. Are there any declarations of interest? No? Are there any other declarations? No. I think just we should mention that obviously one of the speakers who's registered for 20 Thurlow Square, Charles O'Connor, actually, of course, used to be a councillor, in fact. And I think so quite a few of us do. Obviously, we know people who were councillors in the recent past. But I think that's noted. And I certainly haven't spoken to Charles for a long time. So I think there's no problem about us sitting on that case. Okay. Now, we've got one set of minutes. This is minutes from, first of all, let's see, what have we got? We've got minutes from the meeting that was held on the 7th of January. And I think, Arian, you sat on that committee with me. Can I sign those as a true record, please? Thank you. Good. Thank you. Okay. Good. So, before we get underway, I think it might be helpful if I just very briefly explain the order in which we're going to consider matters this evening. The agenda this evening isn't too long, so I hope nobody will have to wait a very long time if whatever you're interested in. So in a moment or two, we're going to start with the applications relating to Thurlow Square. We will then move on to St Albans Grove, Harrods, Cromwell Road, Edith Grove, and then concluding with Holland House Dairy in Holland Park. So we can now, I think, make a start. So we turn to there are actually planning permission and listed building consent at 20 Thurlow Square, and I think Wade Banks. Wade, you're going to introduce this. So please, when you're ready, go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. So as noted, the first item on tonight's agenda are the proposals at 20 Thurlow Square. There are two applications at the site under consideration tonight, the first being a Section 73 application to vary Condition 2 of the extant permission, that's the approved plans, and the other being a listed building consent application for the same works. The application site is located on the corner of Thurlow Square and Alexander Place, and it's a Grade 2 listed building. The proposed works relate to the rear light well of the property. These images of the rear light well are provided for context, but it is noted that these were taken during ongoing works of the property with hoarding above, so they're not the best representation, but the only ones we could get. As noted, there are two applications under consideration, the first being the variation under Section 73, and the second being the listed building consent. In both cases, the proposals seek for the installation of timber French doors at rear low ground floor level, the demolition and rebuilding of the adjacent historic garden access steps into the new in a new form and position, and for the enlargement of the light well itself. These works can be seen in a more zoomed-in section of the drawings here, highlighted in blue. The officer recommendation in this case is to refuse the Section 73 application on procedural and legal grounds, that being, in summary, that the proposed works go beyond the scope of Section 73 by adding new elements to the extant permission and altering the permitted development's description of works. The officer's recommendation is also to refuse listed building consent in this instance, and this recommendation is based on the detailed assessment by both the senior heritage officer and planning officer, which is set out in more detail in the officer's report. In summary, though, the officer has concluded that the proposed development, for several reasons outlined in the report, would harm the special historic and architectural interest of the listed building. Members would, of course, need to reach their own conclusion, having considered the detailed assessment contained in the officer's report, on whether or not the proposed works would safeguard or harm the special interest of the listed building. That concludes my presentation, but I'm happy to take any questions in due course.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Now, this is recommended for refusal. So I think what I'm going to suggest we do, colleagues, is that we ask those who are objecting to the recommendation, who've registered to speak first. And because there are two applications, they can actually speak for up to 6 minutes if they need the 6 minutes, if you see what I mean. So perhaps I think the gentlemen over here are representing this. So who would like to go first and introduce matters? Okay, so please, when you're ready, go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, and good evening, councillors. In many ways, it's very nice to be back, but unfortunately, we're here once again to discuss 20 Thurlow Square. Some of you were sitting in August 2023 when we last came to the committee, but for those that weren't, I'll remind you very briefly. This Grade 2 listed South Kensington house was bought by the elderly applicants in 2019, before COVID. It's extremely tatty and has been much altered over the years. Thanks to the unhelpful approach of certain conservation officers, the owners are still several years off living in the house, with works having only really just got underway 6 years later. And also 2 pre-applications, 17 planning and listed building applications later, as well as hundreds of thousands of pounds of professional fees and much wasted time for these elderly applicants who are trying to carry out a scholarly restoration of their new house. I've been involved since I was a councillor, which I haven't been for over 3 years, if that helps give some context to the delays in this case. The last time that we came to the committee, you had no hesitation in granting permission for the modest opening that the applicants were proposing between 2 rooms on the ground floor. We now find ourselves in a similarly absurd situation that the conservation officer is blocking a very small change to a rear window of the house to enable it to be used as French windows. It involves the removal of about 1 square metre of historic brickwork, all of which will be reused elsewhere in the restoration. When we last came before the committee, councillors Husband and Mackover came to see the house and sensibly took the view that officers were being excessive in their refusal to allow a new opening at ground floor level. The councillors were also shown the basement and the window, which the applicants would like to use as French windows, allowing them access to the rear light well and the back garden. The councillors sensibly said that such a proposal made good sense and best use of the basement as domestic modern accommodation. Encouraged by this, the applicants put in an application for the French windows and other elements of the restoration. Officers went back at the 11th hour and told the applicants that if they didn't remove the French window element, the application would be refused, and that it would also jeopardise all the other applications they currently have in the queue regarding the house. Over a barrel, the applicants withdrew the French windows element and submitted a revised plan. However, the applicants subsequently reflected that they really wanted the French windows from the study, as discussed with councillors Husband and Mackover, and that it is really a fundamental element for them of the renovation of their retirement home, so that they can access the rear garden from that room. I won't bore you with the procedural tussle that has ensued, but suffice it to say that officers have now accepted that the change to the earlier listed building consent can be approved tonight by you, but that the change to the planning permission will require a fresh application, which is no problem for the applicants to do. Essentially, therefore, this whole issue comes down to the question of whether the listed building variation is acceptable. So what we're asking you to do is to take a pragmatic and holistic view, consistent with Councillors Husband and Mackover when they came to view the house, that in the greater scheme of this scholarly and painstaking restoration of the applicant's house, the benefits of this proposed, slightly enlarged opening do outweigh any modest harm to the fabric of the building, and therefore to grant the listed building variation. I'll hand over to Mr. O'Rourke here, who is the applicant's planning consultant, who will explain a little more about why the proposed French windows in the context of this house should be overwhelmingly acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I hope you can hear me. Am I speaking close enough to the microphone? What I would like to emphasise here is the importance in looking at a house like this to see where the heritage value resides. The advice from Historic England is a careful judgment needs to be made about the extent and the level of heritage interest in any particular part of an application. Here in this basement, we have a wholly altered area from the original use of the building, which used to be obviously kitchens, servants' quarters, etc. The kitchen, for many decades, has been on the ground floor, so the basement has for a long time been completely transformed into ordinary domestic living rooms, bedrooms, etc. And all that's been asked here is at basement level, at the most extreme rear part of the house, looking into a little light well, a basement area, a window becoming a door, carefully designed to match the feel and the authentic design of the house, so that the use of that basement can go on and develop in the way it has done for many, many decades. Very, very slight change it will be inflicted on the house in this way, and no important heritage features or fabric will be disrupted. So I would just say that there is no cogent heritage argument to say that this should not happen, and there's every reason to say for the ongoing livability of the house and the use of the house, this is an extremely worthy proposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, there are no, well, I say objectors, but supporters of the recommendation. So we go directly to our opportunity to ask questions. Anyone got any questions? Who'd like to go? Emma, you go first.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask probably Mr. O'Rourke, as a planning consultant, are you aware of any other similar, the rear facade of the buildings in Thurlow Square having been modernised in that way? Because clearly in the old days, as you said, servants' quarters had a different, there was a different lifestyle going on there, and kitchens are used in a completely different way these days. So I'm guessing that there might be. Are you aware of that other people have done similar things in the square?
I mean, I can't pretend I've done a meticulous survey of all the houses in the square, but I would say that being involved in this house and looking up and down the terrace, there's an immense amount of alteration. Some of it harmless and some of it not harmless. The size and nature, depth of extensions varies all up and down the square. And indeed, other squares in central London, in Westminster as well as Kensington, it's a similar picture. And I'd also say that as a general principle, you know, so to add to my answer to your question, it's very common in the inner London boroughs where people have a very meticulous approach to what change is allowed in listed terrace houses. Where can change happen? And often it is the basement area. And frequently, a small extension, say a glazed extension, conservatory, something of that sort, across the full width of the basement. And then as you go up the elevation, less and less extension is reasonable, because you don't want to overwhelm the sense of the original house. Here, all we're talking about is a minor enlargement of the basement area and a window the same width of opening becoming a door. So in terms of other basement level extensions in Kensington and Chelsea and elsewhere in central London, this is extremely minor.
Okay, thank you. Can I just add something? That again, I'm not aware of Thurlow Square, which is one of my favourite squares. Actually, it's very beautiful. Certainly, closet wings have had a lot of changes over the years, haven't they?
Yes.
Because of the use of the house has changed, but the front is remaining as was,
Sure.
or in fact being put back, as it were.
Yes.
It's being improved. So. That's correct, is it?
Yes.
There's no changes to the front. So can people see this offending French window because it's on a corner? Is it, or is there a wall
there's
there?
a wall, and obviously it's at a
Okay.
much lower level.
Yeah.
And the garden level is, because it's a basement area,
Yeah.
the garden level is higher. Yeah, and I think your point is well made, that in a London square, the front is the polite architecture.
Yeah.
What's often called a palace front. In other words, a whole row of houses are treated like a classical palace. But you go to the back,
Yeah.
and informality is much more what you appear to see. You get half landings from staircases. You get various additions and changes to do with bathrooms or other things happening, and the back is less formal. Knocking a strange window or a strange French door in a palace front, the front of the
And it's also on the corner, so there's no overlooking or anything
There's
like that that might
no, not
offend
at
any
all.
neighbours. Okay, no, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
Any other questions? No. I'd just like to make a point of clarification, actually. Earlier it was suggested, because there's planning permission as well as listed building consent. Am I right in understanding that the planning permission is recommended for refusal aside from any listed building consent considerations for quite a narrow legal point, that the application's description doesn't include the French doors, and on that basis it can be viewed as technically technically incorrect. Am I right in saying that you'd be prepared to accept that and simply put in a new planning permission? The important part is the listed building consent. Have I understood the remarks that were made earlier about that?
That's correct, Chairman. Exactly right.
Okay, thank you. Very good. Are there any other questions? No. Arian.
Thanks, Chair. Just following on my colleague, Councillor Dencode's question, it's not visible either from rear of your backside on the other side, but is that rear French window visible from the highway, for example, if someone's walking down? It's not visible. So you think that's your argument against? I mean, the main reason you can read out is the loss of original fabric and the character. So because it's not visible, your argument is that this is acceptable in...
Yeah, it's partially concealed by its own closet wing alongside, and it's also set into the ground. So it really, and there's also a garden fence wall and foliage, vegetation. It's not visible.
Could I just add to that, to say that that's absolutely the point. It is not visible, from adjacent houses or the street. But it's also important to note that on this sort of elevation, we're not talking about a formal classical composition where to disrupt it is clearly a sort of cultural crime, if you like. We're talking about a much more utilitarian elevation where care needs to be exercised, but change can happen without harming heritage interests. And I think this very, very visually low-key change, it's a change, but it's not one that harms heritage interests.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for that. So our opportunity to ask officers about this. I'd like to go first, if I may. I mean, this building, I mean, it was mentioned that Councillor Mackover and I visited. This was in connection with an earlier application. So actually, I and one of my colleagues have indeed been there. I mean, it is indeed a very grand building. On the first floor, at the front of the house, there is a fantastic, well, it's a sitting room that, well, I've got a sitting room on the first floor, but this is more like a small ballroom rather than my sitting room. So we're talking about an extremely fine building, but all of what we're discussing this evening is all tucked away at the back that nobody really sees, and it does strike me that we are setting, normally in these committees we talk about the bar being set rather high for, say, refusing something, but in this case, thinking of the work proposed, surely the bar is very low, really, for something that nobody can see, and as my colleagues have said, apart from anything the applicant and their supporters have said, that we all know that particularly very grand houses, the lower levels of the houses have completely different functions to when they were built in, I don't know, 1830, 1840. Parts of Thurlow Square, I'm sure, are very early. I mean, what's the officer's response to these sort of, to my mind, I'm sort of shamelessly leading what seemed to me to be perfectly reasonable points that are being made?
Thank you, Chairman. I think that's a really good question, because when assessing a listed building consent application, there's only one primary question, essentially, and that is whether or not the proposed works would safeguard or harm the special architectural or historic significance of that building. The legislation doesn't go into detail about whether or not those parts of the building are visible or not. It's just whether or not it would harm those specific interests. And I think the applicant has made some very good points about considering what is it about the building that's special from an architectural or historic perspective, and what elements have contributed to it being listed in the first place, for instance. And in this case, it's things like, not exhaustively, but things like the plan form, surviving historic fabric, and key characteristics of the property. And I think in this instance, if I distill the Heritage Officer's objections down to just a few points, hopefully without butchering the argument, but if I distilled it down to focus on those elements, it would be the loss of historic fabric, so that's the surviving fabric, the alterations to the light well in a way that would be uncharacteristic. Currently, it's quite characteristic for them to be narrow, and this would enlarge it, so they've identified harm there. And then, of course, to the plan form. Now, the extent of harm is a relevant question, but only insofar as if there was going to be applying a balance. So you might find, very often, in fact, with listed building consent applications, there'll be some elements of the proposal that are considered harmful and some elements that are considered to be a heritage benefit. Those can be balanced against each other, and then overall there would be a safeguarding of the heritage asset, or vice versa. Or there would be some public benefits, for instance, that might outweigh that. And unfortunately, in this case, there aren't any, based on the assessment. But that's just the officer's view. Of course, members may reach a different view. But just to explain the question, I hope that helps.
Anyone else? Gerard.
Thank you very much. Just following on from that, in the paragraph where you recommend refusal, paragraph 1 of that, you mentioned, unless I'm reading this wrong, would cause less than substantial harm. So we're almost admitting in that there isn't going to be substantial harm to this, and it is a very small initiative, if you like. Am I reading that right? And the rider to that is if it's less than substantial, on balance, why are we refusing it?
Thank you. I think it's another great question. So the reference to less than substantial is a policy test. essentially what the legislation requires and the national policy framework requires is for you to determine whether or not there's harm in the first place, and then whether or not that harm is substantial. And substantial harm is generally a very high bar. That might be the total demolition, for example, of a listed building, or significant alterations that would harm its special interest to a very significant degree. And in those cases, the legislation says that only in very exceptional circumstances can you then grant that. The less than substantial harm test or bar, so to speak, allows for an officer or a decision maker to balance the harm against any public benefits. So that public benefits might include the provision of housing, or there might be heritage benefits. There could be several examples. And unfortunately, private benefits to a resident don't constitute public benefits, and there's case law around that as well. So yes, the officer has concluded that it will be less than substantial, which then opens the door for any balancing, but has concluded that there is nothing to balance it out, and so therefore has recommended refusal.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm absolutely mystified. I've sat on this committee for a very long time, and we have constantly approved things, against my better judgment sometimes, which were less than substantial harm. I really, really don't understand this. And as far as I remember, wasn't it the end of Thurlow Square? You probably remember, Chair, where somebody was digging basements to put all their cars. Isn't that one where they were digging and digging? It was, yeah. So you know what? We have to be consistent. We allowed that to happen with all the digging and digging for their car collection, whatever it was, and it was a complete mess for years and years and years. And yet somebody wants to put a window. I honestly, I have read all the papers, and I've read the letter that came in earlier today. I'm absolutely mystified as to why this particular application is refused. Is suggested that we refuse. I genuinely don't understand it. And I read all the papers, and I've been doing this for a long time. I'm just mystified. I really am. Help me out, please, because I don't understand.
I think if there's anything you wish to add, but I think you've probably got the gist of where people are coming from. So, do you wish to add anything, just briefly? Or?
I suppose just very briefly. I'm really sorry, but I'm not sure which application you're referring to. But I can say generally. There are instances where an application would result in lesser substantial harm, let's say, based on a judgment. So it's up to the decision maker to judge whether or not it is substantial or not substantial, or whether or not there's any harm at all. But the lesser substantial spectrum, so to speak, is quite wide. Because of how high the bar is for substantial harm, there's a lot of harm between substantial and lesser substantial. So it could be very small harm, all the way up to just before it becomes substantial. So there's a wide range, if that makes sense. I hope I'm explaining myself. And that opens the door, as I mentioned earlier, to public benefits to outweigh that. But public benefits is different to private benefits. And so we might find ourselves in a situation, and we do very often, where the harm to a listed building or even a conservation area might be less substantial, as we've noted. It might even be on the lower end of that spectrum. People often refer to a spectrum, but it's not actually in legislation, but it's just to understand, but without the public benefits, aren't able to, based on the legislation, conclude that can be overcome. So we do find ourselves with, in those situations. The other thing just to note is the legislation does also make it clear that even less substantial harm on the lower end or minor harm is still need to be given significant consideration and assessment. So it might, it's just something else to bear in mind, that even less substantial harm or low harm needs to be taken seriously, essentially.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we need to make a decision about this. My own feeling is that even listed buildings have to adapt over the years to modern use. That's just being pragmatic and sensible. I think in terms of the listed building consent, I think probably the most straightforward way of dealing with this issue would be, and we have to have a vote on the recommendation first, of course, but to consider the listed building consent first. But it may be that we conclude that actually we consider that there simply isn't any harm by what's being proposed, because it's very small scale, as has been discussed. And on that basis, it's not necessary for there to be any public benefits or to go into elaborate discussions about balancing issues and things like that. I suppose we should also note, for the record, that obviously we've spent half an hour discussing this, so it's not as though we've reached, we are potentially reaching a judgment without really having discussed the thing properly or read any of the papers or really knowing what we're doing. So what I'd like to do is to take the listed building consent application first. I think we should vote on the recommendation, and let's see how that takes us. So the recommendation for the listed building consent is that it is refused. Can I see those in favour of that recommendation? Can I see those against? Okay, so the recommendation is not adopted. So we then need a resolution to say why we are not following the recommendation. I would suggest, and I'm happy to propose this, that we straightforwardly, we simply feel that on balance there isn't a harm caused by this. Who would like to second that? Councillor Hargreaves seconds. So that would be the resolution to grant listed building consent. So can I see those in favour of that resolution to grant, please? So that is agreed unanimously. Thank you. Now we also have to make a decision about the planning permission. Now here, the planning permission, the officers obviously had cited the listed building consent reasons for refusal. They've now fallen away because we granted listed building consent. We have the rather technical matter about the description of a development, and I think if I just go back to the officers, I think the argument here, it's a very narrow legal argument, that the description of a development and what is proposed have to marry up. So the fact these doors are not mentioned in the planning permission description, that is something which is technically, that's a technical flaw in the application. Is that your, Fiona, perhaps? Fiona? Or
That's exactly right. So now members have resolved to grant the listed building consent. We could take receipt of another planning application, a full planning application, and there would be no issue in that regard about the technical point.
Well, I think Gerard, yes. Do you want to just quickly?
Just how technical is it? This application has been going backwards and forwards. We're happy with the listed building. How are we really going to be breaking the law that we're all going to end up in serious trouble, or is there room for flexibility? Bearing in mind we are talking about a very technical issue here, and the bottom line of paragraph 2 of the recommendation is planning practice guidance. Is it guidance, or is it we're all going to end up in deep trouble?
No one's going to end up in jail, no, but it is, the decision in our view would be an unlawful one, in the sense that it's not just the practice guidance, but also it's quite clear in case law that any change to the operative part of the development or the description can't be done through a Section 73. It is a frustrating element even for officers ourselves, but it is unfortunately within the legal framework that we operate. But I would say that now that the listed building consent is resolved to grant, submission of a planning application would not come with a reason for refusal for something that's been granted, so there'd be no risk in that sense for the applicant. Could I also just add one thing, if you don't mind, just with the listed building consent? Could I ask if you could please vote on whether or not to delegate powers to officers for conditions, the standard listed building conditions, for the listed building consent, if that's okay?
Well, what conditions would you have in mind? I hope that this wouldn't be another mechanism to create a year's worth of delay and all sorts of matters that suddenly appear from nowhere.
No,
Frustrate development.
No, that wouldn't be the intention. It would be standard conditions around approved plans, details of materials. What we can do, if you would like, is run it by the chairman before issuing the decision, if that's helpful. Sorry? All the agents as well. Yes, absolutely. We can keep everyone in the loop.
All right. I think. All right. Well, I think, colleagues, if you're happy with that, I mean, it seems sensible. Emma, do you want to just quickly?
Yeah, I've completely lost the plot. I don't know what is being proposed now. I don't understand. Is there any way to bypass it, or if they were to build the offending French windows and then apply for a retrospective approval, would that be the end of the world? I just feel very sorry for these people who waited all these years to get on with their retirement home, if that's the case. So I don't know, is there no other way of getting around this? Because it seems insane, actually. Sorry.
I think because it's a legal point, we have discussed it at length, and we don't see a way around it. And I think even the speakers here this evening, alluded to the same. The only other option members could have is to defer the application, and they may want to withdraw it, and then we could take receipt of a new planning application. That's the other option for you if you're reluctant to refuse, but we can leave it with you to come to your conclusion.
I must say, colleagues, I must confess, I'm tempted to say that the description point that's been raised in relation to the planning permission, we could always argue that it was de minimis. I think it would be stretching what de minimis was, because this permission is relating to relatively modest work. But if colleagues wish to go down this route, then I think we could always see what happened. So the recommendation is to refuse planning permission on this point relating to the description of the development, not including the French windows. All right, the French doors, I should say. I beg your pardon. So that the recommendation is to refuse. Can I see those in favour of that recommendation, please? Can I see those against the recommendation? Right, this is the planning, right, okay.
Is it just me, or is it getting really confusing?
No, I think it's everybody, actually. It's not you, Emma. We're making a decision about the planning application. So we have resolved the matter in relation to the listed building consent. So the reason officers put forward for the refusal of planning permission is based around a narrow technical point, that the description of the application does not marry up with the proposed development, the drawings, for example. And I think that is something that we need to consider. There's a definite legal precedent for saying this is a technical flaw in the application. They should have to reapply. That's a perfectly respectable argument. We might decide that we felt the whole matter was de minimis, and on that basis, planning permission should be granted. And the reason would be that we felt what was the discrepancy, if you like, between what is proposed and the description given it's so small in context that we aren't, we feel it should be granted, essentially. So on that basis, I hope that's slightly clearer. Hope I'm making myself clear. So on that basis, the recommendation, officer recommended for planning permission, is that it's, that it's refused on that basis of a narrow technical point. So can I see those in favour of the recommendation, please? Can I see those against? Okay, so the recommendation is not adopted. I would propose in that case, as we've discussed, that we simply say that in this particular case, and obviously we have to consider the circumstances of the particular case, that we feel that the discrepancy here is de minimis, and therefore we are prepared, the implication is that we're prepared to grant planning permission. Okay? And that would be the reason for the resolution to grant permission.
And then if you vote on to grant, that would be great.
Yeah, okay, right. Okay, so I'm content to propose that a resolution to grant planning permission for the reasons that I've just set out, that we feel that the matter before us is, in relation to the planning permission, has now become de minimis, with listed building consent being agreed. Can I see if that's second? Councillor Dent Code seconds. Can I see those in favour? So that is agreed. I think, as I was saying earlier, I think in this case, I think it's right that officers draw up a small number of, a very limited number of conditions, just standard ones that will not be too onerous and not prevent, take months for extra work and time and money in order to fulfill. Is that understood and
absolutely.
accepted?
And we can run them past the applicant team before issuing the decision.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed, everyone. Thank you. Excuse me. If we can, thank you. If we now move on to consider the application at 2 St Albans Grove, and I think, Mr Banks, that's back to you to introduce the report.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So the next item on tonight's agenda is the proposals at 2 St Albans Grove. I just draw members' attention to the addendum report, which notes 2 further objections that were received after the publication of the officer's report. So the application site in this instance contains a detached 3-storey plus lower ground floor dwelling house located on the southern side of St Albans Grove. This is an aerial imagery of the property just for context. The property is an asymmetrical detached villa with a bay to the ground floor and flush porch with square section pillars. While the building is generally in proportion with its surroundings, it is slightly wider and slightly taller than the others along this side of the road. The application in this instance includes several elements. I'll just run through them very quickly. A proposed mansard roof extension with 4 dormers and flat roof lights. The demolition of a non-original rear garden storage extension, rear balcony and garden stairs, and the installation of a lower ground floor rear extension and terrace with stairs to the garden level. The reconstruction of the side/rear extension at lower ground floor level. The removal of 2 trees in the rear garden. The construction of a garden shed. The demolition and replacement of the front boundary wall and works to the front garden, including the installation of stairs to the light well. The replacement of a light well window with French doors. Excavation below the front garden to provide a storage space, and iron railings and gate to the front boundary. The replacement and reconfiguration of windows to the front, side and rear elevations. The demolition and relocation of the side access steps to allow access to the repositioned side door. And finally, the lowering of the lower ground floor level of the house itself. These works can be seen in the following images. So on the left is the proposed and what's being proposed to be demolished, and on the right is the proposed works. This is the rear elevation, where you can see the extension in the mansard. And finally, the side elevation, where you can see some of the proposed changes to the windows, and again, the rear extension. That's not an exhaustive list of the drawings, but just for context. So these images have been extracted from the submitted visual impact assessment. That was updated during the course of the application to include images taken from a 50mm lens. And based on the assessment contained in the officer's report, the recommendation is to grant permission subject to the recommended conditions. And this concludes my presentation, but I'm happy to take any questions in due course. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I think Mr. Bark and Mr. Cook, I think you join us, and you're local people and objecting to the application. So when you're ready, please, you've got up to 3 minutes between you. So please go ahead.
Hello, does that work?
Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Joe Cook. I work with Michael Bark at Verara. I also live at number 3 St Albans Grove. We're objecting to the new roof, the new story, on the basis of the impact it would have on the streetscape of St Albans Grove and the character and appearance of the De Vere Conservation Area. Commenting on St Albans Grove, number 2 is already the tallest building on the street, slightly taller than 32A Victoria Road, considerably taller than number 2, and somewhat taller than the row of duplexes going to the west towards the Builders Arms. It's not just me as a neighbour who's got a problem with this. Every St Albans Grove resident has objected. Some of the hipped roofs along St Albans Grove, including this house, have Velux windows, and there's a single dormer, which is at number 9, I think, behind, not too visible, behind a tree. The proposed full 5th floor will be highly visible at both the front and the rear, towering unsympathetically over its neighbours. We can talk about this later perhaps, but we take objection to the visualization. Verara produced its own visualization with a 50mm lens taken from a more sensible angle, and you will see from that just how aggressive the new roof is. Moving to policy, this is CD12, roof alterations, additional stories to be sympathetic in form and character to the building and group buildings. Appropriately designed additional stories to be permitted where they make a positive contribution to the townscape. This proposal is neither sympathetic to the existing building nor to other buildings along St Albans Grove. I know this is subjective, but as I say, everybody along St Albans Grove took one look at it and said, no. It would not make a positive contribution to the townscape, quite the opposite, and it greatly detracts from the skyline and impairs the streetscape. CD12 is being breached here. The basic principle there is additional stories to be resisted, ... This is an enlargement of a large existing building. There's no new housing units being created, and I understand RBKC and Whitehall want to promote appropriate development, but this is overdevelopment. Looking at the officer's report, one of the key issues that the argument for the roof revolves around is that the assumption the officer's report makes that the habitable space in a hipped roof is already, quote, an additional story, implying CD12 does not apply. With respect, this would appear to be illogical. CD12 as a conservation area policy relates to the visual impact of the new story. The visual impact of the present hipped roof is 0. It cannot be seen from the front or the rear at any angle. The impact of the proposed new mansarded story would be strongly negative, both at the front and at the rear, where it would be a straight line towering above the neighbouring gardens. Policy CD12 makes no reference to existing habitable rooms, nor should it. And if one thinks about it, if every hipped roof in Kensington, Chelsea were already an additional story, CD12 would be in shreds. It makes, with respect, it makes no sense. We would ask this to be refused because of the impact on the street and conservation area. One footnote is that I don't know if the RBKC considered it or the applicant, but it would have made more sense to advise the applicant to consider seeking dormer windows in the existing hipped roof line There is precedent along the street for that, both at the front and along the back. The full mansarded new roof is way too aggressive and an imposition on the streetscape. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
45 seconds left.
Now, Michael, do you want to say anything? Just a sentence or two, perhaps?
The test for additional stories is that it should be appropriately designed, but more particularly it makes a positive contribution to the streetscape and to the townscape. Our contention is that this one does not, because it is too dominant and therefore it doesn't meet the test for allowing it.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, Mr. Ambrose, you're here on behalf of the applicant, so you have up to 3 minutes as well.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Can everyone hear me? Thank you very much, Mr. Cook and Mr. Buck. I'll just jump straight in, I guess, and the first thing I'd like to go through is the process that we've been through. Over the last 14 months, we have undertaken 1 pre-application with the council, 2 planning applications, of which this is 1, and 2 neighbourhood consultations. Throughout the process, the key design changes that we have made are as follows. Removal of a proposed 2-storey rear extension, reduction in depth of rear extension and reduction in the size of the terrace, full site investigation to map tree root locations, reduce the scale and number of windows to the mansard extension, adjust to the location of the mansard windows to provide a distinction between the roof and the main facade, lowered the mansard height so it matches the existing ridge height. The bulk of the current objections are focused on the top floor extensions, which is covered by policy CD12, as Mr. Cook and Mr. Buck have referred to. I'll now respond. Policy CD12 does not rule out the possibility of adding roof extensions. Policy CD12 requires roof alterations to be sympathetic to the form and character of the host building or group of buildings, and obviously the character of the conservation area. 2 St Albans Grove is a detached building that has its own distinct character on the street. The design incorporates the following gestures which ensure that the roof extension is sympathetic to the host building. The mansard is set behind parapets to both sides of the building. It doesn't go vertically straight up on the rear. It's set behind a parapet, as can be seen in our section drawing number 300. The height of the mansard matches the existing ridge height. The windows are appropriately scaled and positioned to ensure that they read as separate elements to the principal facade. They're not aligned with the windows on the principal facade, and they're designed to be read as part of the roof and not part of the facade. It's designed on purpose. 2 St Albans Grove does not form part of a group of buildings. It should be judged on its own merit in the streetscape as a distinct building. It is not the same as number 3 or numbers 4 to 11 St Albans Grove, which are the hipped roofs that Mr. Cook was referring to. A large proportion of policy CD12 does not apply due to the following. The building is not part of an existing terrace. It is not part of a mansion block. The proposals do not have an impact on a significant skyline or important public views. It does not involve the addition of an additional story on top of an existing roof extension. It does not involve alterations to a dormer window or a roof of historic interest or architectural merit. The existing roof is suitable for an extension, i.e. it does not have overhanging eaves, which are specifically mentioned in policy CD12. I would also like to address some other concerns raised by the objectors regarding the proposed mansard extension at 2 St Albans Grove. Firstly, design and placement. The mansard is set back behind parapet gutters from the front and rear elevations, as shown in section drawing 300. It is not set flush to the elevation on either the front or the rear. Accuracy of information. All submitted visuals and drawings, including 3D renderings, are accurate to scale and based on the same BIM model. The views are taken from the pavement. We have used a 50mm lens to create some visuals in the visual impact assessment. We do not agree that these are misleading.
Conclude your remarks, because I'm sure there will be questions to...
Sure, yeah, no problem. And the effect on the character of the area. The mansard is designed as a secondary recessive addition with a precedent for a very similar design approach at the neighbouring number 3 St Albans Grove. unique character. As a unique and distinctive property, alteration to number 2 should be assessed as such. It is a building of singular architectural merit in a relatively varied streetscape. I would urge the committee to approve the application as it is well considered, policy compliant and respect to the site's context. We have worked hard to engage with the council and neighbours throughout the process, and we remain committed to doing so moving forward.
Okay,
thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much indeed. Colleagues, questions to either party? Who'd like to go first?
Thank you, Chair.
No, yeah.
I'd like to speak to our friends from St Albans Grove. There's been a focus on the roof. Is that the main complaint about it? Because there are other things like, it seems, the extension of the terrace at the back and so on. Are they not the main points? Is it the roof specifically? Okay, it's just the roof that you've got objection to. Okay, thank you. And as we've heard... Sorry? Okay. Is the... okay. No, that's what I just wanted to check that. Thank you.
Any other questions? No. I'd just like to ask the applicant. At the moment, there are these Velux windows in the roof. Are there actually rooms below that? This question of whether there's an extra story created or not.
Yes,
can you help me about that?
Yeah, sure. There is. There are habitable rooms up on that floor, and the staircase goes all the way to that floor.
Okay, well, in that case, thank you very much indeed, all of you. So, questions to officers. Gerard, would you like to go first on that?
Yeah, obviously we're going to ask about the story, new or not new. Can you button that down and clarify? Because it does strike me, looking at it, there is a story there that's just been made bigger. But when is a story not a story?
Sure, absolutely. Yes, there is habitable accommodation in the roof level already, so I don't believe this is an additional story, rather a reconfiguration of the roof, essentially. Just to clarify, when I mean reconfiguration, it would be larger because it would now be a mansard, but not an additional story. Yeah. Just in case that was misleading.
Any other questions? No. Okay. Oh well. Thank you. Well, in that case, we need to make a decision. Yeah, it's a difficult one because I think, as has been said, the applicant property is a sort of standalone property at the end of St Albans Grove. I mean, it's a very large house. And perhaps unusually in that context, it's not immediately replicated by its the neighbouring properties. So what do we think about this? What do we make of what's proposed?
I think it's a step too far, Chair. And I think if this is extended, people will be taking the mickey, and other people over the years will go higher and higher and higher, and I think that's a huge shame. I think we should stop right here, personally.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think on balance, particularly with very large buildings, looking at them elevations on a page doesn't give you quite the right sense of what it will really look like in the street. I mean, St Albans Grove is, it's quite a wide street, but it's not an enormously wide street, and we're talking about large buildings. So the difference between, something that a mansard that is set back, I'm inclined to feel that on balance it perhaps is not that prominent. And also it does look quite well designed in the sense that replacing Velux windows in a building of that sort, again, on the front elevation, I think is something that I think arguably is a perfectly reasonable thing to be doing. But other views? what do other people think? Or should I just move? Should we just move to a vote and see what happens?
It's one of these difficult
John.
ones that we often have to
John,
look at
yeah,
on balance, don't we? That we might not like the look of it, but is it actually breaking any planning regulations? Is it contravening? We might think it's too big, we might not like the look of it, but from what we're hearing from the officers, it's neither a new story, it's an existing story. It's designed well. It's not. There isn't a uniform pattern along the road. So it's a difficult one, isn't it? And it's, as always, when we say these things, it's going to be an on-balance decision.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think in that case, what I'm going to do is put the recommendation, which is to grant permission, to the vote, with the conditions attached, set out in the report. Can I see those in favour of granting, please? Can I see those against? Okay, so that is granted by 3 votes to 2. So Councillors Adurian and Dent Code voted against, but it's granted by 3 votes to 2. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, everyone. Thank you. Can we now turn to the application relating to an advert at Harrods, please? Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Chairman. So the next item on tonight's agenda are the proposals at Harrods. The application seeks advertisement consent for the proposed installation of printed fabric scaffolding wrap to the Hans Crescent facade, and the addition of a large rectangular illuminated sign, advert banner, on the right-hand side of that scaffolding. There are no speakers on this case, but based on the assessment contained in the officer's report, the recommendation is to grant advertisement consent in this case. And that concludes my presentation, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions about this? Emma?
What's going to be printed on the shroud, do we know? Will it just be an image of the building on the behind it, or is it going to have something horrific?
No, that's a good question. The majority of the scaffolding wrap would be an image of the building, but there would be a section of it that would be for an advert on the right-hand side.
So there will be an advertisement?
Yes, there would be an advertisement on...
Because that matters, doesn't it?
Sorry?
So how big is it?
Oh, the adverts, I can say now.
Is it on here? Sorry.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. I'm just going to quickly put up the drawings.
Yeah, it's huge.
It'll be... Here we go.
It is not numbered.
So it'll be, there's 5 bays where the scaffolding would be, or 4 bays, sorry, where the scaffolding would be. And the advert would be on the 4th bay. It'll be 22.4 meters wide and 18 meters high. So it'll be the width and height of that bay, in line with the previous consents at the site.
That's not a digital one, it's just the boarding, right?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Is that a digital advert screen, just a normal boarding?
Yeah, so the majority of the scaffolding, so bays 1, 2, and 3, would just be an image of the building behind. The bay 4 would be an advert, if that answers the question, sorry.
It's not like a screen or anything, but it is illuminated. So, yeah.
Mr. Chairman, could you just talk us through the illuminated bit? I appreciate it's not digital, it's not going to be flashing, but the brightness is condition, yes. Is that going to be, have we put a condition in about hours or that it can be illuminated, or have I missed that? Sorry.
No problem. I don't believe, I'll just double check, but I don't believe there's a condition on hours. But yes, there is a restriction on the illumination. Essentially, it'll be a fabric advert, but there'll be lights along the top that shine down onto it so you can see it. I'll just quickly go to the officer's report to double check those conditions.
But this is right. This is opposite residential property, isn't it?
Yes, so the maximum steady brightness of the illumination shall not exceed 52 candelas per square meter. Typically on high streets, we allow up to 685 candela per square meter, so this is significantly lower than that of a typical, let's say, illuminated sign on a shop front, if that makes sense.
But how many lights would there be on the board? I understand, I mean, the illumination might be less in terms of the street light, but if you talk about the number of lights.
That's a great question. Just give me a moment while I find that. I think it might be, but before I go... Oh, it looks to me from the plans that it's a strip rather than individual floodlights, if that makes sense. But that's based on the drawings. There's a blue strip on the top that it refers to, if that answers the question.
And we've got a time limit, so it's a period while this work is going on, the work to the building is going on. Yeah, okay, all right.
Yes, and that is to the 30th of November of this year.
Okay, all right. Okay. Any other questions to officers? No? Okay. Well, in that case, I think the recommendation is that we grant the advertising consent set out in the report with conditions. Can I see those in favour of granting, please? So that is agreed. Thank you. If we can now move to the application in Cromwell Road, which I think is actually a hotel in Cromwell Road. It's a hotel garden in Cromwell Road, isn't it?
Thank you again, Chairman. So this is a Section 73 application which seeks to vary Condition 22 of the extant permission for the hotel, and essentially to allow food and beverages to be served in the rear garden. Condition 22 relates to the operational management plan, which is what they're seeking to amend. The hours of operation and other similar controls would be the same. It would just allow them to host events in the garden between the hours of operation that they currently have. There's no speakers on this case, and based on the assessment contained in the officer's report, the recommendation is to grant permission, but I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Any questions relating to that? No. Sorry, Gerard.
Just condition 5. Could you just explain that to me? I found that a bit confusing, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so just a bit of context. There were quite a few more objections on the extant permission. I think there was about 41. And as is right to do so under Section 73, is to reconsider all of the conditions, and we haven't decided to recommend all of them again. We felt some of them weren't necessary anymore. But question number 5 in particular is no music shall be played within the premises, the subject of permission, so as to be audible outside the premises. Could have been worded slightly differently, but essentially what that's saying is the music can't be played loud enough where people outside of the site would hear it and disturb them, essentially.
In the garden as well?
It talks about within the premises, so yes, my interpretation would be within the garden, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? No. In that case, I think we can make a decision. It's the recommendation that this is granted with the conditions attached. Can I see those in favour, please? So that is agreed. Thank you. Next, can we turn to the application for 98 Edith Grove, please?
Thank you again, Chairman. So this application relates to a second floor flat at 98 Edith Grove. The application is for the proposed, essentially for the alteration of the rear outrigger roof to form a roof terrace within it. This is similar to some of the other properties along this terrace. Based on the assessment contained in the officer's report, the recommendation is to grant permission, subject to the conditions, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay. Questions? Anyone got any questions about this? Gerard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I obviously know this area very well, and it's a tight-knit buildings on top of buildings, around buildings, and I do have some sympathy with some of the objectors about the potential noise, the potential disturbance. I don't know whether you've got an answer to that, or it's just sharing a concern that this is really, really an overlooked area.
Yes, I agree. It is quite a tight-knit terrace and surrounding development. I think in this case, the officer has considered, of course, the objector's concerns. They are material objections. Privacy and noise and disturbance are key considerations in this case, as is any other case. The officers concluded, though, based on the size of the terrace itself, which is quite modest in scale, its location and the presence of other similar terraces in the area, that the degree of potential harm would be quite limited. In terms of noise and disturbance, its scale wouldn't allow for large gatherings, for instance, or its use in a manner that would be much noisier than that of a typical rear garden or within a typical flat itself. And in terms of privacy, there would be, if you stood on the very end of the terrace and you tried to look back at the neighboring window, you would see it, but not in a manner that would result in passive overlooking or a significant loss of privacy. And so for that reason, the officers concluded that it would be acceptable on those grounds. But of course, the members will need to reach their own conclusion.
Okay. So need to make a decision about this. Recommendation is to grant. Can I see those in favour, please, of granting? Those against? So that is granted by 3 votes to 2. So Councillor Adurian and Councillor Hargreaves voted against. And it is granted. Thank you. And finally this evening, we consider the application in Holland Park, Holland House Dairy.
Thank you again, Chairman. Yes, this is the final item on tonight's agenda. The application seeks both planning permission and listed building consent for the proposed replacement of the glazed viewing window and shutters, but within the existing window frame, reinforcement and repair of the door assembly, and the provision of new lighting. It's quite a unique property. It was quite interesting to read up on this one. But based on the assessment contained in the officer's report, the recommendation is to grant planning permission and to grant listed building consent, subject to the recommended conditions. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay. So this comes before us because it's a council-owned property. Any questions relating to this? No. And no, there's been no conservation concern about altering a shutter or doing something to a historic door in a dairy in Holland Park. No? So the
officers raised no objection.
No. So the recommendation is to grant. Okay, so there are actually 2, of course, here. First of all, we must consider the planning permission. The recommendation is to grant. Can I see those in favour of granting, please? So that is agreed. And then there's a listed building consent. Can I see those in favour of granting listed building consent? So that is agreed as well. Very good. Well, thank you very much indeed, everyone. That concludes our business for the evening. Thank you.